Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thanks to the BSBI team for the invite to talk to you today. And this actually follows on very nicely from the talk Debbie and Carl gave earlier. So I'll be presenting, this will be a very quick run through a huge amount of conservation and research work undertaken into the beautiful Marsh Saxifrage at its only remaining site in Northern Ireland. And this is work that's been led by the Northern Ireland Environment Agency in partnership with Queen's University and specialist consultants, etc. So just a little bit of background. I work for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds up in Northern Ireland on a project called Cooperation Across Borders for Biodiversity, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we refer to it as CAB. And it's funded by Interreg 5A and managed by the Special European Programmes body with match funding by DAERA and the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government in Ireland. So it's a big project. We have mostly peatland sites in Scotland, some in Donegal and Northern Ireland, and obviously we're looking with great interest at all of the species associated with these sites. And the Garron is one of our key sites. I'm sure some of you may even have seen the species on one of the previous BSBI field trips up to the Garron previously. So I will try and do justice to all of the good work that's been done by many others. Very briefly, just to give you a context for the species, the declines in Ireland really reflect the declines we've seen across Europe for this species, such that it's really been lost from its historical lowland sites. It's now effectively considered a montane species. It's lost from many countries in Europe, and in Ireland it's now reduced to 3 sites. I do stand to be corrected by Maria. I see Maria's here from NPWS, and they've done some very good work on the populations, as you'll see down in Ireland around Bellacorrick in County Mayo. And I believe that they've identified recently 3 populations in the Ox Mountains in Sligo. And you'll see up in the north, its only remaining site on the Garron. So Garron, Ireland has an international responsibility to conserve this species under the European Habitats Directive. And because it's now only found at the one site in Garron, it's considered critically endangered in Northern Ireland. It's therefore an SAC and an ASSI designation feature for this site. So on the Garron back in the 1880s up to the 1920s, like most of Northern Ireland, it was rare but relatively widespread. And Praga found 3 sites on the Garron, but it's down to the last survey since 1996. It's only been found at 1 location on the Garron. So even here, we're finding that its range is contracting quite alarmingly. So here we are. Here's a little bit of a more detailed map. You can see the concentration of populations around Bellacorrick. I believe in Mayo now, I think the most recent findings is about 16 sites there, 3 in the Ox Mountains, and as I said, just 1 up in the Garron. You can see the site at the Ox Mountains there, and the 2 historic populations in Northern Ireland are Coleraine and Rasharkin. And I'll come to the Rasharkin site, the historic Rasharkin site, a little bit later on. So given its status in Northern Ireland, I think the feeling is that augmentation or reintroduction to historic sites may be the only way really of maintaining the viability of the population of the species. Given that its location on the Garron, it's only found in 1 small area of 1 flush site on the site. So obviously it's very, very vulnerable to extinction, potential extinction up there. So I think we really need to be considering fairly drastic measures of reintroducing it or even introducing it to new sites if they're deemed suitable. This requires a multidisciplinary approach which has been used. So some very interesting retrospective genetic modeling has been undertaken. Using herbarium samples from extinct populations and samples from the current populations. That's been combined with a very detailed landscape habitat suitability modeling, looking at the current suitability of habitats and also potential habitats, and then sort of more detailed micro habitat analysis of these landscapes, looking at the individual sites where the species does or may occur, looking at such factors as the hydrology, the chemistry, and the management history, which is obviously very important, as we'll see. So the results from the genetic modeling are very interesting, slightly alarming for the Garron population. So we see that the Garron population, the genetic diversity is markedly low, lower than any of the other Irish sites, for example, and that the lineage that both it and the extinct Rasharkan population come from seems to be a single genetic lineage now, which is now very rare in the rest of Ireland. Only one of the Mayo populations appears to show this lineage. And all of this shows that great care will be required in formulating any reintroduction programs. Sort of technical terminology revolves around higher seed set and germination versus outbreeding depression effects. For lay people like me on the ground, as it were, I think it's really just, you know, would any potential seed be suitable? Would it actually stick to the habitat if we were to re-establish it in new sites? And the landscape modeling, again, it's a little bit alarming for us up on the Garron. So we see generally that suitable habitats in Ireland are very limited. Generally to mires above about 175 meters, with a mean maximum annual temperature of less than 15 degrees centigrade. And obviously, this is currently a big concern in terms of climate change, in that it may put greater stress on current existing sites, and also may make other potential sites unsuitable. So it's a big factor for us to factor in the conservation work. And the Garron habitat, Plateau habitat, is generally sort of seen to be suboptimal compared to the Mayo populations, for example. The positives, though, are that the models do identify at least 5 other potentially suitable sites in the Antrim Hills, and also the historical Rasharkan site does seem to be coming out with some potential still. And this will require further work. These sites will need to be visited in more detail, and suitable for suitable microhabitats. These flush sites within these mires will need to be investigated further. And here's a map showing that the results of that landscape model. You can see that the vast majority in blue, the vast majority of Ireland now is deemed to be unsuitable, and that the most suitable areas, those areas in sort of green into red, are those populations around County Mayo, a little bit around the Ox Mountains there. And you can see in Northern Ireland that Garron is seen to be suboptimal, but that the Rasharkan site is showing some potential there. So that's encouraging for us in looking for potential new sites. Site-specific factors. You can see from when we compare the Garron site to, for example, the Mayo sites or sites in Scotland or the populations in the Pennines, that the individual vegetation communities associated with the Garron site, they're all different. So a one-size-fits-all approach is not necessarily appropriate. The current vegetation community which the Garron population is accorded to is an S27 Carex rostrata potentilla palustris tall herb fen, with a sort of mosaic of M15B wet heath and bits and bobs of N4, M6 Carex Fagnum mires, generally falling under the European Annex 1 transition mire and quaking bog and wet heath types. In Scotland, it's generally associated with the M9 Carex rostrata Calliagonella cuspidatum giganteum mires. And interestingly, Kelly up on Garron back in 1999 accorded it to this. So whether the habitat is changing slightly or the community is evolving slightly, or whether that's just a recording artifact may merit further investigation. In the North Pennines, it's associated with the M38 spring vegetation. And interestingly, again, the Garron site, although typically of the Saxifrage sites, it's a calcareous flush. The Garron site does show notably lower calcium, magnesium, and pH levels than pretty much all of the other sites, both Ireland and across the water. And also, interestingly, Garron shows high iron and manganese, and these are absent from other sites. All of this is showing us, again, a little bit like the genetic studies, that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't appropriate, and we really need to look almost individually at each potential host flush site to look at its suitability and viability. Management factors are obviously critical. And back in 1999, when Kelly did his survey up on the Garron, he noted that the site was probably getting slightly overgrazed. It's all sheep grazing up there. And generally sheep are seen to be more suitable than cattle for this species. But even the sheep did appear to be causing some damage, both directly to the plants and also, very importantly, stopping seed set. So the flowers weren't getting the chance, the plants weren't getting the chance to flower adequately. So the conclusion was that careful grazing management would be crucial. Grazing to keep the sward in check and trampling to help create those sort of microhabitat structures for seed set, effective seed set. Therefore, in 2001, NIEA established a fencing exclosure effectively to keep the, we call it an enclosure, but to keep the sheep out. And initially, this was very successful, such that by 2006, there was seen to be an increase both in flowering shoots and in the vegetative plants in the ramets. However, within a few years, this was already decreasing again, such that by 2009, none were seen. So based on this concern, NIA then established a very intensive manual cutting program, actually using scissors, which you can imagine was quite a lot of work. But the results of this were pretty favorable, so that we were seeing flowering shoots again by 2013 and an increase in the ramets, or the vegetative parts of the plants. 2013, they also started a seed collection program with germination trials undertaken at Kew. And the initial results of this were very favorable. So we're getting good germination. This would be something to discuss with Debbie and Carl, for example. We were getting good germination from those trials, but the plants just weren't surviving to sort of become, robust, usable plants, transferable plants. So we need to investigate the factors around those a little bit more, whether it's the low genetic diversity or whether it's the growing conditions within the sort of the sites where they've been grown at Kew.
Gareth, can I give you a 2-minute warning?
Okay, great.
We don't have too many questions, but we're running a little bit late. So.
Okay, very nearly done. A couple of very quick slides. And this shows the grazing enclosure 2006 and just shows you the development. You can see the light color of the holcus and the agrostis there. And that was basically becoming a problem, in terms of sward, was becoming too rank and dense for the species. This is it after some of the cutting by NIEA, showing an excellent sort of microhabitat condition structure. You can see the comparison with the long sward, and you can actually see some of the plant flowering in the back sampling quadrat there. But obviously that's not an effective long-term solution, and grazing really will be the tool to consider, and we obviously want to manage it properly. So what next? CAB, the sort of main element of it will be the delivery of the management plan, and that will obviously feed into the species action plan for the species for the next 10 years or so. So we need to maintain the existing population, obviously, and obviously continuing intensive monitoring. So any management that we do undertake in the short term, we make sure that doesn't have deleterious impacts. And we want to have a closer look at those old historic Garron sites and also the other sites identified in the Antrim Hills, looking for those suitable microhabitats. Farmer support is obviously crucial. So if we do identify either existing previous sites which may be suitable, or new sites which we may need to look at and consider, farmer support to make sure that farmers are supported adequately to manage those sites will be crucial. And that's a key part of the management plan we're writing. And obviously, we're looking at transplantation, looking at possibly even using that Sheehan population, and if we can get the seeds collected from the Garron to actually take for us would be the ideal. Okay, folks, this is some key references which will be available for you to look at on the recorded version as well. And I think that's my lot. Thank you. Thanks, Jim.